Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about many different issues explored in novels, especially a novel about escaping to a small town on Lake Michigan and the impact of climate change on communities, with my guest, Scott Spires. He is a freelance writer and translator. He has published many articles on subjects such as linguistics, urbanism, and archaeology. He is a geography editor at Encyclopedia Britannica, and formerly was a beer correspondent for Prague Business Journal, and also formerly an on-staff translator for the Moscow office of Baker McKenzie. His books include Abandon All Hope and his most recent one, Social Distancing, a novel. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you back on Environmental Directions.
I'm glad to be here.
You cover so many different issues in such an interesting way by using the novel format. I thoroughly enjoyed Social Distancing because you covered topics such as converting a church to a brewery, a small town that had urban people escaping to it, the culture clashes. You had stories about a professor who was trying to find himself and had to deal with a new environment, his family, everything from Icelandic culture. Perhaps you should describe what the novel is about.
The original impulse to write this book came to me a couple of years ago. I wrote it from the summer of 2022, starting then, finished it in 23, and it was published this year by Alternative Book Press, which is a literary press located in New Jersey. But the impetus was really COVID and the period of instability that surrounded it. I mean, you'll notice that the title of the book is COVID-related, and a couple of the section titles are also COVID-related, even though the word COVID does not appear in the book at any point. But I was noticing at the time there was a trend of people in the big cities and the metro areas were thinking about escape. They were thinking, how do we get out of the chaotic and dangerous environment that we suddenly find ourselves in? And there was a lot of talk about escaping the cities also because what you might call the remote revolution was happening. COVID had forced millions of people to work from home, to work remotely, and a lot of them discovered that they liked it that way. And so they started thinking about relocating. They realized they were not tied to any specific geographical location. And a lot of them started taking interest in various other possible places to live, which could be foreign countries, but also in America, there was a lot of interest in traditional small towns, rural communities, being out in nature as sort of a sense that one could go back to the land almost and live there more peacefully. And that was one of the inspirations for the book. In the book, my hero, Fred Traubert, his name is, he's a middle-aged professor of Germanic languages, and he's been working in a college in Philadelphia, and he's become very discontented with the academic life, and he's got something of an overactive imagination, so he gets haunted by his fears of climate apocalypse, of societal collapse, and he thinks, I should relocate to a small town. And this small town would have to be in the Great Lakes region because he's read the climate studies and things like that and has determined that the Great Lakes region is going to be one of the safest places in this time of climate change. So he relocates to a small town called Roverton, which is a fictional town. I made it up based on my personal knowledge of towns in the area. He resettles in this little town, but he finds that life still has a lot of challenges. You know, he has difficulty fitting in with the local environment. His family is kind of in disarray, and that doesn't help his situation. Meanwhile, the town itself is being transformed by an influx of people who are similar to Fred. That is, people with some sort of professional background moving in from the cities because they've found this traditional small town, and they've decided they like it. So that's the setup of the book.
Your setting of the novel on Lake Michigan. You happen to live in Lake Bluff, which is on Lake Michigan. What's that
That's right.
environment like?
It's a very nice place. It's a far northern suburb of Chicago, and it was founded in the mid-19th century, and its first claim to fame was what's known as a Chautauqua, which is a sort of educational camp that people went to for self-improvement purposes in the 19th century, and it became a kind of summer resort because a lot of rich people in Chicago at the time, which was very industrial and polluted in the 19th century, and of course air conditioning hadn't been invented, they would come up here to the Bluff to get some clean, fresh air and enjoy the moderate climate. From there, it developed into a rather picturesque suburb. We've got a lot of nice architecture here, and it's a very almost European type of environment, very walkable, very dog-friendly. We've got an award-winning brew pub. We've got artisanal restaurants and things like that. It's a bit like living in a resort town, but without a lot of tourists, which is rather nice.
It's wonderful that you created this fictional place based on some real-life places. You put it together. I was surprised to hear that climatologists predict that the Great Lakes area will be one of the most stable areas in the world as the climate changes.
Yes. In fact, if you look in various media, including very mainstream sources like the New York Times, you'll see predictions that places like Duluth, Minnesota, way up on Lake Superior is going to be a sort of climate refuge. And there was another source I read which stated that in the year 2050, the single best place to live in the world will be the state of Michigan. Obviously, I don't know if this is true. The thing is, the weather has shown us that making these predictions can be something of a fool's game, because look at Hurricane Helene, which we just experienced a couple of months ago. That hit a part of western North Carolina that a lot of people had believed would be safe from climate disaster. In fact, they said the city of Asheville was going to be a climate refuge. Well, it turned out not to be.
I think we're at the point where we really don't know what is going to happen, where the natural disasters are tremendous, changing whether or not it's earthquake, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and where they're occurring, and the severity has changed. We can't really predict much as we see the global warming rising.
Yes, that's definitely true. And in the aftermath of Helene and then the other hurricane which struck Florida, I forget what its name was, then I heard a lot of voices saying there is really no such thing as a climate refuge. You can play the odds, you can look at probability, but the idea that you can find a place which is livable, which is sustainable, and where nature is going to leave you alone in its more vicious manifestations, that's a naive idea. I mean, there's always going to be some degree of uncertainty.
We certainly have to pay more attention to what's going on and make the necessary changes, but your book was influenced by other literature, other events and trends, some of those that you were talking about, and you blend the style of American small-town literature with that of Central European essayistic fiction. Describe how you do that and what the difference is.
American small-town literature is a distinct genre. I don't know how far back you want to go, but if you look at works like Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, which might have kicked off the modern variant of this, that dates from about 1918 or 19, so it's over 100 years old. But there's also writers like Hemingway and Faulkner were also working within that genre to an extent, and then more modern writers like Raymond Carver, Marilyn Robinson, Richard Russo seem to specialize in it more. So I had sort of those, maybe that literature was kind of in the back of my mind. But there was also, when I talk about the Central European essayistic tradition, first of all, my main character, Fred Traubert, is a former professor of Germanic languages, which means he's been immersed for his professional life in a certain style of writing. A lot of writers working from Central Europe, people like Robert Musil, Thomas Mann, a variety of Milan Kundera, people like that, would often, in their fiction, would put essayistic asides or sections or try to blend ideas into the story in perhaps a more explicit manner than writers in the Anglo-American tradition do. And so I wanted to bring that in to give the book a certain flavor and also just as a way to explore ideas.
As a translator, you have read literature in other languages. How did that influence your stories?
It influenced my stories mainly in providing the professional background for my main character in the book, who's a specialist in Germanic languages and who frequently makes mention of foreign language works or throws the occasional German or Scandinavian word into his narrative.
You brought in so many different stories. It seemed as though every few pages there was another issue, another occurrence, another activity, another event that the main character was involved with that seemed totally unrelated to the previous one. I found it interesting that all of a sudden he's bringing up Icelandic literature because he talked about it. How do you explain that environment, that culture, that language in this story on the Great Lakes?
One of the things I was trying to do was bring in connections that maybe people hadn't noticed. First of all, why raise the Icelandic thing at all? Partly it's because one of the things that Fred wants to achieve by relocating in this small town is he thinks we can ride out whatever coming disasters here and we can keep civilization going somehow. And he's influenced by, for instance, the medieval tradition of huddling in your monastery while the Vikings are pillaging the city nearby and just keeping civilization going. And so he thought of Iceland, first of all, just because he's been immersed in that kind of literature, but secondly, because medieval Iceland was a very small society. It's hard to get exact population figures, if you probably can't, but estimates say that during what we think of as the Icelandic golden age for literature, like the 12th or 13th centuries, we're talking only about 40 or 50,000 people lived on the entire island. Yet they created this very extensive literature, which we are still reading today. It's really an amazing achievement, and it was done in a very small society. So Fred is thinking that his town of Roverton could be a similar incubator for civilization.
Indeed, he actually created a project for himself where he was interviewing all the old-timers, the long-term residents, getting their stories, and was planning to put a book together.
Yes, that's right. He started out doing that with a few locals, but it ran into trouble because one of his informants turned out to be a habitual confabulator, a guy who just likes to ramble and make up stories. I suppose what I was getting at there was the question of fitting in and really knowing a place, because Fred has arrived in this small town. He's feeling isolated. Even though he's left academia behind, he hasn't left behind the habits of mind of an academic. He needs to be doing some sort of intellectual project, so he starts this thing up. But since he doesn't really know the local town in its depths yet, he's still got rather superficial knowledge, it's easy to mislead him about certain things. So it shows the difficulty that one has integrating as a newcomer, and also how do you apply your old intellectual habits to a new situation?
This reminds me of a classic study as an anthropologist of an anthropologist who went into the field and the informant made up stories and he didn't realize it till 6 months later and had to start all over from scratch.
That's exactly what I was thinking about when I came up with that scenario. There was also a linguistic counterexample. There was the linguist Benjamin Whorf did research amongst the Hopi in the early 20th century, and apparently part of the problem with his research was that some of his Hopi informants were having him on, and he was unable to discern when they were telling the truth and when they were deceiving him.
You have some great stories, and I want to talk more about some of the different things that happened in your wonderful novel, Social Distancing, when we return in a moment with my guest, Scott Spires.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Scott Spires, who is a freelance writer, translator, and author of Social Distancing. In your book, you have raised a few environmental, animal rights issues, but very subtly. You didn't present them as a cause to be dealt with, but as an issue in terms of relationships. And I'm thinking of where a neighbor decided that a neighbor's dog needed to be euthanized because it wasn't well. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that story?
The story of Wesley the dog, which appears about halfway through the book. This is a case where I was really trying to illustrate the culture clash between the old-timers, the people who had lived in the town forever, and the newcomers who were moving in from somewhere else. In this story, Fred, he gets to know a couple of these newcomers. You know, they work remotely, some sort of corporate job, and they have an aged dog named Wesley. And Wesley is very much on the decline. He's about 15 years old. He has various health problems, yet these newcomers insist on keeping him alive. And Fred is trying to hint to them somehow that really it's time to end the burden of Wesley's life and let him slip away peacefully to doggy heaven, but he can't state it directly. He's inhibited from doing so. So instead, he tries to drop a suggestion to one of his old-timer neighbors, and then things sort of get out of hand from there.
One has to read your book to find out all that happened.
Yeah.
We don't want to give it all away. It was fun encountering what happened with all of your stories. Throughout Social Distancing, the main character had his dog speak to him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do dogs speak to a person?
Dogs speak to a person if the person is lonely and needs someone to talk to, and then he imagines his dog talking back to him.
I particularly enjoyed a story that you put in about the main character having an essay writing assignment in 5th or 6th grade about going blind. And what would you do if you find out you have only 6 months left? And I just recently saw a documentary where a family had 3 kids going blind, and they took off a year to go around the world so that the children would have memories of beautiful sights, nature, history, all sorts of places. How were you inspired to decide that maybe one should not only prepare for that change in one's health, but also how to get the most out of the sight?
The idea for this story came actually from a real-life event where in grade school, I mean, this might have been 6th grade or 8th grade, I don't remember exactly, we were assigned an essay where they said, you will go blind in 6 months or a year, I forget exactly which, but the point is, you will go blind, there's nothing you can do about it, how are you going to prepare for it? I wrote a strictly pragmatic thing about learning Braille and learning to cope with the physical shortcomings, and another student in the class wrote actually a much more positive essay about how she was going to travel around the world and see all these great things that she hadn't been able to see yet. When I heard that, I thought my original response is really lacking because I should be making more use of, my answer should be more like hers while not completely disregarding the practical aspects of it. And I think a blend of the two aspects, the practicalities and the fun, the final burst of joy that you get from being able to travel and see these things, it would be best to combine these two. I thought this was a very good metaphor for the way my main character looks at the world. Because at a certain point, you may recall his son, Ethan, tells him that his problem is that he's not being driven by his hopes, he's being driven by his fears. And this shows how that actually worked. It's like, yeah, you're being driven away from the city to this small town because you're afraid of something. But think more in terms of your hopes. Think of what you're trying to achieve, of what you want to leave behind. You don't want to live in a cave. You don't want to be like one of those survivalists who has several years' worth of canned food stored up in the basement. It's about achieving the right balance between your hopes and your fears, I think.
I was particularly enthralled by the story of a woman who had been a songwriter, a musician, and then decided to go sort of undercover. She disappeared in the desert. Nobody knows if she was alive or dead, and how the culture of people and youth has changed. And you talk about the interest of students in literature or their lack of interest in literature. What were some of those stories?
First of all, the one that you mentioned about the folk singer who disappeared in the desert, that is actually based largely on a true event. If you're a fan of folk rock, you might have have been aware of a band called the Incredible String Band, which came out of Scotland in the late 60s, and they played at Woodstock, and they released several albums and garnered a fair bit of attention, and then they broke up, I think, in the 70s sometimes. But one of their musicians was a woman named Christina McKechnie, whose nickname was Licorice. I don't know exactly why. It might have been because of her very black hair. She was known as something of an eccentric and adventurous person, and she was last seen hitchhiking across the Arizona desert in 1987. There has been no confirmation that she's either alive or dead since then, but if you root around on the internet, you often find people commenting saying, "Oh, Licorice just wanted to disappear. Leave her in peace, folks. Nothing to see here." And if she were alive, she'd be almost 80 years old today, but no one has ever proven that she's either alive or dead. Well, I found this a fascinating story, and I thought it would be interesting to bring it into social distancing, because what she's doing is she's doing a similar thing to what Fred Traubert is doing. They're both trying to escape. Now, in my version of the story, the character based on Licorice is still alive. She's living in a small town in Vermont. She's very much undercover, but a certain event forces her out of her shell, so to speak. And I thought it made an interesting counterpoint to Fred's own story, because they're doing kind of similar things, but for dissimilar reasons.
You explore in the novel young people's interest, how it's changed, how they're not as interested in learning the same way as previous generations, how they are not reading the literature. Do you think that that's going to make a difference on how they care about the environment?
It might do so, because if you're not willing to delve into actual books, your knowledge of a certain subject is likely to be more superficial.
We've only touched upon the many stories that you wrote about. What were some of the others that people could enjoy reading about?
They could enjoy reading about the ideological journey of Fred's son Ethan, the one who runs the brewery. He's become captivated by various online ideologies, and he's basically looking for something to believe in, and he goes through various enthusiasms in the book, although they don't really affect his day-to-day work, because he's got a real job and real responsibilities at the brew pub that keep him from going off the deep end.
Because you have written about archaeology, you presented the main character's son as starting a brewery in an old church and saving that old church by putting it to a new use, a new purpose. Is that what's necessary in these towns, both the new large urban areas as well as the small rural areas, not to tear down the historic structures but to preserve them and to repurpose them?
I personally am a big fan of preservation, and also of preservation that takes the form of conversion. If you have a beautiful structure, unless there's some pressing reason to tear it down and replace it with something else, then I think it should be preserved. And I think this example that I gave of a church converted into a brew pub, this is something that already exists in a number of places. I was first introduced to it when we were passing through Pittsburgh a few years ago, and there's a place called, I believe, the Church Brew, and it is exactly that. It's a converted church that is now a brew pub, so we stopped there for a pint. In the town of New Buffalo, Michigan, which is right on Lake Michigan, just like my town, Roverton, is, there's also a beer church. It's more modest than the one in Pittsburgh, but it's the same basic idea. So we're seeing things like this all over the country in some ways, and not just in small towns, but in big cities. Often they're urban neighborhoods that consist of converted industrial space. They make old warehouses into lofts and studios or apartment buildings. They get renovated, but they still preserve a lot of their original character. And I think it's a very good idea, partly for terms of cultural and historical continuity, and also just because a lot of these places are attractive spaces that we would want to preserve.
Can we preserve the Great Lakes, the natural area? You didn't speak too much in your novel about the beauty of the area of this small town, but isn't it important that the natural features are preserved as well as the built features?
Yes, it's extremely important, in fact. One of the inspirations for the book, and the reason why I said it where I did, is because we like to take driving tours around the Great Lakes, and we stop at the small towns and at the breweries and other interesting human places, but we also enjoy the nature. I mean, the nature is outstanding, particularly in the summer. There's the very important fact that 20% of the world's fresh water is there. In times when we are afraid for the future of the planet and are worried about whatever climate apocalypse might be on the horizon, being situated that close to so much fresh water is just a very important thing. It's very positive, and there's a vast amount of agricultural land that surrounds it.
We certainly have to preserve and protect our clean waters, keep them clean, our air. We have to handle human waste, and you have an incident in the book where it mobilized the community that normally didn't show up at town meetings, but because of an accident with a trash truck on small winding roads, they all of a sudden got together and said, this is a dangerous situation.
Mm-hmm. I'm delving a bit into human psychology there because it just seems to be the fact that a great many people, perhaps a majority, don't really want to take serious action or precautions until the disaster shows up in their living room, so to speak. I think it's just the way people tend to think. And I want to point out also that particular incident that I described in the book is based on an incident that I actually witnessed myself. It was in the year 2000, and I was living in a small town at the time, Lambertville, New Jersey, on the Delaware River. And as I described in the book, a truck slammed into a video store, and it killed the woman who was working there. And I knew her a little bit because I used to rent videos there. But for years, people had complained about these big trucks trundling down, I think it was Route 29, and saying that this was a disaster waiting to happen. And those people who warned about that were exactly right.
I wish we had time to talk about all the stories that you shared in the novel. I just encourage everybody to get a copy of Social Distancing, a novel. How do they reach you? What's your website? Where do they go to get this charming book that's really a delight to read, easy reading, but has so much in it to make one ponder and think about and relate to? You'll have information on your website, or they can write to you about who's distributing the book, when and where?
You can get it on Amazon as usual, but I also encourage people to visit my Substack. It's called Lakefront Review of Books, and I write about literary topics there. I've got several essays about the book itself, covering many of the things we've just been talking about here.
And your website is?
And I have my old personal website at swspires.weebly.com. That's spelled swspires.weebly.com.
Since you are a translator, are you going to be translating this book into other languages?
No, because like most professional translators, I only work into my native language, which is English.
Have you already planned out your next novel, what environmental issues you're going to cover?
My next novel, I am actually just about beginning to write it now. It's going to be a futuristic dystopian novel, and because it's set about 10 to 15 years from now, I'm pretty sure that environmental concerns will play a role, though I am not really sure how serious a role.
I want to thank you so very much for sharing your writings with us. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me on. I
have been speaking with Scott Spires, who is a freelance writer and translator and geography editor at Encyclopedia Britannica and author of Abandon All Hope and his most recent book, Social Distancing. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.